There is a document in the Oregon State Archive, filed under the heading Abandoned Settlements, Bell County, 1894, that contains a single sentence someone has underlined in faded pencil. The underlining is not from the archivist. It was there when the file arrived, sometime in the late autumn of that same year. The sentence reads, "No further inquiry is warranted at this time." The file, in its entirety, is 11 pages long. 11 pages to account for an entire community. 31 men, women, and children who had, by the fall of 1894, simply ceased to exist as a matter of official record. Not dead, not displaced, not accounted for through any of the relocation programs the state occasionally ran for failing settlements along the timber frontier. Simply, no further inquiry is warranted at this time. I first encountered that sentence on a Tuesday in November, in the reading room of the Oregon State Archive in Salem, seated at a table with a fluorescent light that flickered every 40 seconds with the reliability of a metronome. The archivist who had brought me the file, a woman named Constance Halper, 62 years old, 23 years in that building, stood beside the table for a moment after she set it down. She didn't say anything. She just looked at the folder with an expression I had seen before, on other archivists in other cities. The expression that means, "I have been waiting for someone to ask about this." The folder smelled of cedar and something else, something older and harder to name, the kind of smell that accumulates in rooms where things have been kept out of sight for longer than anyone currently living can remember putting them there. I opened it. What I found over the following 3 months of research, travel, and correspondence with historians, legal scholars, and the one living descendant I was eventually able to locate and persuade to speak with me. What I found was not a mystery in the sensational sense. It was something more troubling than that. It was a pattern, a deliberate, methodical erasure of a place and the people who had lived in it, executed with the quiet precision of someone who understood, in 1894, exactly how institutional forgetting works, who could be made to look away, what could be filed under headings that discouraged further inquiry, how many layers of documentation needed to be absent before the absence itself became invisible. The place was called Blackwood Falls. The county was Bell County, Oregon. The year the last person left, or was made to leave, was 1893. Before I pull the next thread of this story, subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? Because what happened in Blackwood Falls did not happen in isolation. It happened within a system, and that system had a very long reach. I drove to Bell County on a morning in late October, when the Coast Range was still holding fog in its upper passes, and the logging roads off Highway 18 were the color of old iron in the wet. I had printed directions from a topographical survey published in 1961, the most recent official map I could find that still showed the creek drainage where Blackwood Falls had once been. The 1961 map labeled the location as Historic Site, No Facilities. Every map published after 1978 omits it entirely. It took me 40 minutes to find the clearing. It is not a dramatic place. The Pacific Northwest has a way of absorbing what humans leave behind. The forest closes over abandoned structures with a patience that borders on indifference, and after 130 years, very little remains to suggest that anything was ever built here at all. There is a depression in the earth that might once have been a root cellar. There are stones arranged in a line that could be the foundation of a wall, or could simply be stones. The creek still runs cold and clear through the eastern edge of the clearing, the same creek whose fall gave the settlement its name, but the trees are still there. The old-growth Douglas firs along the perimeter of the clearing, the ones that were already substantial in 1893, the ones that were too large to be easily felled and so were left standing when the timber company came through in 1901 to harvest whatever remained of value. Those trees are still there, and on approximately 40 of them, at a height of between 4 and 6 feet from the ground, there are names. Not graffiti, not the casual carving of initials you find in park trees near hiking trails. These are deliberate, careful inscriptions, each name cut with evident intention into the bark in a style of lettering that a historian at the University of Oregon, when I showed her photographs, identified as consistent with mid to late 19th century penmanship. Some of them have been partially overtaken by the tree's own growth over the decades, the bark swelling outward and beginning to absorb the letters from the edges inward, the way water erases writing left on a beach. In another 50 years, some of them will be gone entirely. One name appears more often than the others: Sarah Miller. It appears on 9 separate trees, in what appears to be multiple different hands, different people carving the same name, in different seasons, perhaps in different years, as if the act were not a single event but a sustained one, a refusal, repeated, that one particular name should disappear. I stood in that clearing for a long time. The fog had not lifted. The creek ran with the sound of something patient and indifferent, and I thought about the kind of fear that makes a person pick up a knife and walk to a tree in the middle of a forest and cut a name into the wood, knowing no one will see it except, perhaps, someday, someone who comes looking. Someone who comes looking. That is what I was. That is what this story is about. To understand what happened in Blackwood Falls in the autumn of 1893, you have to understand what Bell County was in 1893, which is to say, you have to understand what it was not. It was not a county in the administrative sense most of us recognize. It had been formally organized as a county only in 1887, 6 years before the events I am describing, and its infrastructure, such as it was, consisted of a part-time county clerk who worked from his home in Astoria, a circuit judge who passed through twice a year, and a sheriff's office with 1 full-time employee, Julian Thorne, 34 years old, appointed in 1891. The historical record on Thorne is sparse but consistent. He appears in 3 separate contemporary accounts as a man of unusual precision, not in the bureaucratic sense, but in the observational one. A reporter for the Astoria Morning Budget who interviewed him in 1892, in connection with an unrelated land dispute, described him as someone who speaks slowly and looks at you as though he is reading a document and has not yet reached the line that will change the meaning of everything before it. That is, I think, about as accurate a description of Julian Thorne as I have found anywhere. He received the letter on October 7, 1893. The letter is still in the county records. I held it. It is written on plain paper, in a careful, controlled hand that shows some evidence of having been copied over from an earlier draft. There are places where the pen hesitates slightly at the beginning of a word, the trace of someone who has thought carefully about exactly what to commit to paper and what to leave out. The letter informs Deputy Thorne that the settlement of Blackwood Falls, located approximately 32 miles southeast of Astoria along the drainage of Bell Creek, has not received any communication from its residents in more than 6 weeks. The writer, who does not sign the letter with a full name, only the initials E.S., states that this is unusual and that she has reason to believe the community may be in distress. She. The initials E.S. I want to pause here for a moment because that detail, the gender, the anonymity, the deliberateness of the partial identification, matters. In 1893, a woman writing to a county official about a possible crisis in a remote settlement does not sign her full name for a reason. She signs her initials because her name, attached to the accusation she is making, would carry consequences she may not have been confident she could survive. We know who E.S. was. We will come to her. Thorne departed for Blackwood Falls on October 9th. He documented the journey in his field notes, a practice he maintained throughout his career, writing in a small leather-bound notebook in a shorthand of his own devising that his descendants later had partially transcribed. Those transcripts are held by a private collector in Portland, a retired schoolteacher named Marcus Albright, 71 years old, who spent 11 years locating and acquiring everything he could find related to Thorne's career after stumbling onto a reference to the Blackwood Falls investigation in a footnote of a 1978 academic paper on Pacific Northwest law enforcement history. When I visited Albright in his home outside Portland, a house where every flat surface has at some point been used to sort papers, and which still bears the ghost marks of that organizational labor, he served me coffee and looked at me for a long time before he said anything. This is what I have found over 3 months of reporting. The people who hold pieces of this story always look at you first. They are deciding whether you are the kind of person who is going to understand what you are being given. He decided I was. He brought out the Thorn transcripts. The field notes from October 9th describe a journey through terrain that Thorn found increasingly difficult as he moved away from the established logging roads and into the drainage basin. He notes the weather, overcast, temperature dropping, and the state of the track, which had not been maintained and showed no evidence of recent use. He notes the silence. This is a detail he returns to in several entries during those days. The silence. The absence of the ordinary sounds of habitation. Smoke, voices, the sound of a mill operating. There was none of it. He arrived at the settlement on the evening of October 11th. The settlement of Blackwood Falls had been established in 1887, the same year Bell County was organized, by a man named Nathaniel Sterling, who had purchased the timber rights to approximately 2,000 acres of Bell Creek watershed from a land speculation company based in San Francisco. Sterling was 41 years old at the time of the settlement's founding, originally from Vermont, previously employed as a manager for a lumber operation in northern Michigan before moving west. The few photographs that survive of Nathaniel Sterling show a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that communicates authority so efficiently it doesn't need to perform it. In the one photograph I have been able to examine in detail, a formal studio portrait, likely taken in the early 1890s, he is looking slightly to the right of the camera, as if the camera itself is not quite worth his full attention. He was the owner of the only mill in the settlement, the only general store, and through a system of supply credit that he administered personally, the effective holder of the economic survival of every family that had come to Blackwood Falls to work his timber operation. By 1891, through a combination of geographic isolation, carefully managed debt, and the systematic control of what supplies arrived in the valley and when, Nathaniel Sterling had made himself something that the legal vocabulary of 1893 Oregon did not have an adequate word for. He had made himself, in the most practical sense, a sovereign. The families who came to Blackwood Falls, the Millers, the Hargroves, the Wards, the Kennedys, the Putnams, came because they had been promised wages and a new beginning in a landscape that was still, in 1887, genuinely wild enough to feel like possibility. What they found, over the following years, was that the wages were always slightly below what had been promised, that the supply credit was always slightly more than what could be repaid on those wages, and that the company store charged prices that ensured the debt never quite closed. This was not unusual for timber settlements of the period. It was, in fact, standard practice across the Pacific Northwest and throughout the extraction economies of the American frontier. The word for it, then as now, was debt servitude, though very few people, then as now, used that phrase out loud when the man who held the debt was also the man who decided whether you ate that winter. But Sterling's operation differed from comparable settlements in one crucial respect, and it is a respect that took me some time to fully understand. His control was not merely economic, it was informational. The postal route that served Blackwood Falls ran through a relay point at Sterling's mill. He was, by his own arrangement with the circuit postmaster, the official recipient of all mail for the settlement. Letters arrived. Some of them reached their intended recipients. Others, by all evidence I have found, did not. A woman named Agnes Ward, who left Blackwood Falls in the spring of 1893, 6 months before the events I am describing, eventually made her way to Portland, where she was interviewed in 1896 by a journalist writing about labor conditions in Oregon's timber industry. The interview was never published. The journalist's papers are in a private collection I was granted access to for this project. Agnes Ward is quoted in those notes as saying the following, that she had written to her sister in Ohio 4 times in the 2 years she lived at Blackwood Falls, and had never received a reply. That she had assumed for a long time that her sister simply wasn't writing back. That it was only after she left the valley that she understood what had happened to her letters. Her sister had received none of them. There is no way to know at this remove exactly how many letters Nathaniel Sterling opened, read, and destroyed. There is no inventory of what he controlled, because the man who controlled information also controlled the records of what information had existed. But the pattern, the silence that descended on Blackwood Falls, the way the settlement became opaque to the outside world over the course of Sterling's tenure, that pattern is visible in the absences. In the relatives who stopped hearing from family members and attributed it to the difficulties of frontier life. In the county records that show almost no correspondence from the Bell Creek watershed during the years 1889 through 1893. In the circuit judge's log, which shows that he visited Blackwood Falls exactly once during that entire period in 1890, and noted only that the settlement appeared orderly and self-sufficient. He had been escorted through the settlement by Nathaniel Sterling personally. Julian Thorne arrived at Blackwood Falls on the evening of October 11th, as the last light was failing and the temperature had dropped to somewhere near freezing. He documented what he found in language that is characteristically precise and characteristically drained of affect, the language of a man who has learned to let the facts perform the function that emotion would perform for someone less disciplined. The settlement was intact. The structures, 14 dwellings, a mill building, a store, a small church, were standing and undamaged. The mill was silent. The store was locked. The church was unlocked but empty. In the first dwelling Thorne entered, the Hargrove house which stood nearest to the creek, he found a table set for a meal that had not been eaten. The food on the table was long past edible, but its presence implied something that Thorne notes explicitly. The departure had not been planned. People do not abandon food on a table they intend to return to, but they also do not, in an orderly and considered evacuation, leave food on a table at all. What they do, apparently, when they leave a place in circumstances that Thorne's notes describe only as of a nature I have not previously encountered, is take their most portable valuables, leave everything else, and go. He searched the settlement over the following 2 days. What he found, building by building, was a community that had been simultaneously abandoned and, in some particulars, deliberately altered. In 6 of the 14 dwellings, the mirrors, small, framed mirrors of the kind a family of limited means would have brought with them on a long journey, and kept carefully because they could not easily be replaced, had been broken, not accidentally, not in the chaos of a hasty departure. They had been broken deliberately, the shards in some cases swept into careful piles, as if someone had broken the mirror and then cleaned up after themselves, which is precisely the kind of detail that means something, and that a less careful investigator than Julian Thorne might have noted only as vandalism. But Thorne had grown up in a community of Welsh immigrants in western Pennsylvania, and he recognized what he was looking at. The breaking of mirrors is an act with specific cultural meaning, an act of grief, of severance, of marking a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. The families of Blackwood Falls had not destroyed their mirrors in panic or rage. They had destroyed them in mourning. Something had happened here that they were marking with the deliberate ritual of people saying goodbye to a place where something irrevocable had occurred. The trees along the clearing's perimeter were, by Thorne's October 11th entry, already carved. He noted approximately 30 names in his initial survey, in the handwriting of multiple individuals, at heights suggesting both adults and older children had participated in the carving. He noted that one name appeared more frequently than the others, and that unlike the other names, which appeared once or twice each, this name appeared on multiple trees in what he characterized as a pattern of insistence, as if the carvers intended that this name, specifically, should not be able to disappear even if a single tree were to fall. The name was Sarah Miller. He spent the rest of October 12th looking for her. Sarah Miller was 28 years old in the autumn of 1893. She had come to Blackwood Falls with her husband, Thomas Miller, and their daughter, Clara, who was 4 years old when they arrived in 1889. Thomas Miller had been killed in a mill accident in the spring of 1891. The official record lists the cause as imprudent operation of the saw rig and assigns fault to the deceased. There is no record of any investigation into the accident. The circuit judge who would have presided over any inquiry was not in the county at the time. After Thomas's death, Sarah Miller had remained in Blackwood Falls, working in the mill store under an arrangement with Nathaniel Sterling that appears in the store's account books. Books that survived because they were taken as evidence in the later legal proceedings in Seattle, as a reduction of the Miller family's outstanding debt in exchange for her labor. The account books are a cold document, as account books tend to be. They record transactions. They do not record conversations, or the terms under which agreements were reached, or whether the person who entered into an agreement had any meaningful alternative. What they do record, and what I noticed on my second reading of the photocopied pages that Marcus Albright provided me, is that the reductions in the Miller family's debt balance during the period of Sarah's employment are systematically smaller than they should have been given the hours of labor the books themselves document. The arithmetic is not difficult. Someone was skimming, and since the only person with the authority to adjust the balance was the man who owned the books, the arithmetic points in one direction. By the summer of 1893, Sarah Miller had been working in the company store for 2 years, and her family's debt had, by the account book's own figures, barely moved. There are 2 people in the record who knew Sarah Miller well enough to have described her to subsequent investigators. One was Agnes Ward, whose interview I have already mentioned. The other was a woman named Louise Putnam, who gave a statement to Thorne in November of 1893, after Thorne had tracked her to a boarding house in Portland where she had arrived, without resources and with her 3 children, in early October. Louise Putnam described Sarah Miller as someone who had a mind that moved fast and quiet, which I have thought about a great deal since first reading it, because it is an exact description and not a sentimental one. She described a woman who had learned, in the years since her husband's death, to observe rather than to speak, to understand the machinery of her situation without showing that she understood it, because showing that you understood it was dangerous. She described a woman who, in the final months before the settlement's collapse, had become very still and very watchful. She described her in the past tense throughout, which tells you something about what Louise Putnam believed had happened to Sarah Miller. Thorne found, on October 12, 1893, no evidence of where Sarah Miller had gone. He found her dwelling, which had been emptied more thoroughly than any other in the settlement. He found her daughter Clara's few toys, left in a row on the floor of the back room with a precision that did not suggest haste. He found, under a floorboard near the hearth, and this detail does not appear in any account I have found outside the original field notes, which suggests it was deliberately kept out of any formal report, a piece of paper folded very small, in what appeared to be a woman's handwriting, containing a partial list of dates, each date followed by a 2- or 3-word notation in a code or shorthand that Thorne could not decipher. He removed the paper and kept it. He did not find Sarah Miller. Julian Thorne would spend the next 3 weeks in the Bell Creek watershed, following every lead the settlement's physical evidence could provide, and he would not find her. What he would find, eventually, was something that explained why her name was on 9 separate trees in 9 separate hands. The diary of Eliza Sterling was hidden under a mattress in the master bedroom of the Sterling house, which was the largest structure in the settlement, set apart from the other dwellings on a slight rise at the western edge of the clearing. Thorne found it on October 14th. He could not have known, when he pulled back the mattress, what he was looking at. He could not have known that the woman who had written those initials in a careful hand at the bottom of the letter that arrived at his office in Astoria on October 7th had spent 3 years creating, under the same roof as her husband, one of the most methodical private records of institutional violence I have encountered in any period's documents. He found the diary, and he sat down on the floor of that room, and he read it from beginning to end. His field notes from that day are the longest single entry in the transcribed collection. They contain, in the margin of the final page, 3 words in a slightly heavier press than the rest of the text, as if Thorne bore down on the pencil without entirely meaning to. The 3 words are, "She knew everything." Eliza Sterling was 44 years old in 1893. She had married Nathaniel Sterling in Vermont in 1872, before either of them had moved west, before Nathaniel had found the particular shape his ambitions would eventually take. In the diary, she does not say when she began to understand what her husband was. She does not offer an origin story for her knowledge. What she offers, in entries that begin in the spring of 1890 and continue through September of 1893, is a chronicle. The chronicle begins with what might seem, to a careless reader, like ordinary domestic notation, the date, the weather, the state of the household. But embedded within these entries, in phrasing that is careful and sometimes indirect, she was writing in a house where she could not be confident she was alone, is a running account of what was happening in Blackwood Falls, the supply manipulations, the debt adjustments, the letters that arrived at the mill and were brought to Nathaniel's office and never distributed, the conversation she overheard through the wall of that office in which her husband's voice was always level and certain, and the other voice was always something else. She wrote about Sarah Miller in 8 separate entries over 18 months. She wrote about her with the precision of someone who was watching carefully, and with an admiration she permitted herself to record only indirectly, noting the days when Sarah moved through the store with a particular efficiency. The days when Thorne noticed, and this is Eliza Sterling's own word, that Sarah had begun keeping a mental record of the discrepancies in her family's account balance. She had noticed. And Nathaniel, Eliza wrote in an entry from March of 1893, had noticed that she had noticed. The entry from July 14, 1893, is 12 lines long. It contains no description. It contains no direct account of any event. What it contains is a date, the notation, the Hargrove Trail, afternoon, and then 11 lines about the weather over the following week, the temperature, the state of the creek, the quality of the light in the clearing in the mornings. 11 lines about weather, written by a woman who had never before devoted more than 1 sentence to meteorological observation in 3 years of entries. Julian Thorne understood what those 11 lines meant. He had been a law enforcement officer for a decade. He knew the language of not writing things down. He knew that a woman who was capable of the chronicle she had been keeping, and who suddenly turned to 11 lines about the weather, was not suddenly interested in the weather. He went to the Hargrove Trail. I will not describe what he found there, because Thorne himself did not describe it in his notes, and because the restraint he exercised in that omission was deliberate and should be respected. What I will say is that the Bell County Coroner's Inquest, held in Astoria in December of 1893, returned a finding of death by misadventure on a forest trail, which is the language of a finding that no one with any authority was prepared to challenge at the time, and which the subsequent legal proceedings in Seattle did not revisit because the prosecution was pursuing different charges and did not need it. What I will also say is that the names on the trees in the Blackwood Falls clearing include, in a hand that I believe, based on comparison with the diary entries I was allowed to examine, is Eliza Sterling's own, the name Sarah Miller, carved into the largest of the Douglas firs, at a height of approximately 5 feet, in the careful and deliberate lettering of someone who wanted to make sure it would last. She carved it herself, in the forest of the man she was married to, before she left. Eliza Sterling left Blackwood Falls in the first week of September 1893, approximately 5 weeks before Thorne arrived. She took the diary. She left nothing in the house that could be traced back to her except the one thing that she calculated would eventually be found by someone looking for it. The small sheet of paper folded under the floorboard in Sarah Miller's dwelling that contained the coded date notations. A breadcrumb, a signal to a reader who would understand it was meant to be found. She had, by the time Thorne located her through contacts in Portland, reached Seattle and was staying with a distant cousin. She was not hiding, but she was not visible either, which is a different thing. She had understood that simply leaving was not enough. She had understood that she needed to be findable by the right person and not by the wrong one. Thorne traveled to Seattle and met with her on November 18, 1893. His notes from that meeting run to 14 pages, the most extensive interview record in his entire career. The notes begin, "She was seated near the window, facing the door, and she did not look surprised to see me." Of course she wasn't. She had sent him the letter. I will not reproduce the substance of what Eliza Sterling told Julian Thorne in that room in Seattle in November of 1893, because reproducing it is not the right approach to what she did. What she did was hand him, document by document, from a leather case she had carried out of Blackwood Falls personally, 3 years of evidence. She gave him the diary. She gave him account book pages she had copied in her own hand during nights when Nathaniel was away, pages that documented the debt adjustments and supply manipulations. She gave him a copy of a letter she had, with considerable nerve, made a copy, that Nathaniel had written to the San Francisco Land Company in the spring of 1893, detailing the financial terms of his arrangement with the settlement families, in language that, read carefully, described debt servitude in the vocabulary of business correspondence. She told him about Sarah Miller. She told him what she believed had happened on the Hargrove Trail in July. She told him with the flat, measured clarity of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is finally permitted to set it down. Thorne asked her, according to his notes, why she had waited. Why, given that she had known what her husband was doing since at least 1890, she had spent 3 more years in that house in that valley before acting. Her answer, as Thorne transcribed it, was, "Because I needed it to be enough. Because if I left too soon, there would not be enough, and he would simply find somewhere else to do it." She had waited until she had everything. She had waited until the archive was complete. Nathaniel Sterling was arrested in Seattle on February 14, 1894, on charges of fraud and extortion arising from the account book evidence Eliza had provided. The fraud charges were not difficult to prove. The account books were meticulous records of his own crimes, as such records tend to be when the person keeping them is confident they will never be examined. He was convicted in June of 1894 and sentenced to 7 years in the Washington State Penitentiary. He served 4. He was released in 1898 on a health deferral and died in Portland in 1902. His obituary in the Portland Morning Oregonian is 6 lines long and describes him as a pioneer of the Bell County timber industry. It does not mention Blackwood Falls. It does not mention Sarah Miller. It does not mention the 31 people whose lives he had organized for 6 years around the maintenance of his own interests. The murder charge that Thorne had built his case toward, the charge that the evidence on the Hargrove Trail, combined with Eliza's testimony and the date notation in the coded paper, had been intended to support, was never filed. The prosecuting attorney in Seattle, whose name was Albert Carey, wrote to Thorne in March of 1894, explaining that the coroner's inquest finding of misadventure meant that any murder charge would require the inquest to be reopened and its finding overturned, which would require the cooperation of the Bell County Circuit Judge, who had declined to assist and whose reasons for declining Carey characterized only as matters of professional judgment. The circuit judge's name was William Forsyth. In 1895, 1 year after Sterling's conviction, Judge Forsyth accepted a position as legal counsel for the same San Francisco land company that had sold Sterling his Bell County timber rights. He held that position until his retirement in 1911. The connection between Forsyth's career and the Blackwood Falls investigation does not appear in any official record. It appears only in the private papers of Albert Carey, who kept, it turns out, a very thorough personal archive of the cases he felt had been resolved inadequately, which were donated to the Oregon Historical Society in 1946 by his son, and which have been cataloged but not extensively studied. I found them in October. The families of Blackwood Falls scattered after 1893 in the way that people who have survived something they have no official language to describe tend to scatter. Widely, quietly, and with a determination to put enough physical distance between themselves and the place where it happened, that the place begins to feel like something that might have happened to someone else. The Hargroves went to California. The Wards, as I have mentioned, went to Portland, where Agnes Ward eventually gave her interview to the journalist whose notes survive. The Kennedys and the Putnams both made their way to Seattle, where the city's rapid growth in the 1890s offered a degree of anonymity that small communities did not. Louise Putnam, who gave her statement to Thorne and described Sarah Miller as someone with a mind that moved fast and quiet. Louise Putnam raised her 3 children in Seattle, married a second time in 1897, and died in 1931. Her daughter, Margaret, who had been 7 years old when the family left Blackwood Falls, kept a shoebox under her bed until her own death in 1978 that contained, among other things, a photograph. The photograph is of a woman standing in front of a building that, from the style and the surrounding landscape, I believe to be the Blackwood Falls Company store. The woman is looking directly at the camera with an expression that is not quite a smile but is not quite something else either. On the back of the photograph, in an older style of handwriting than the printing on the image, are the words, Sarah. Summer 1892. I know about the shoebox because Margaret Putnam's granddaughter, a woman named Patricia Keller, 67 years old, a retired schoolteacher outside Seattle, agreed to speak with me in September after 3 months of correspondence. She met me at a diner in Kent, Washington, arrived 15 minutes before I did, and had already ordered coffee. She had brought the shoebox. She set it on the table between us, and then she sat back, and she looked at me for a long time. I recognized the look. I had been looked at that way in archives and living rooms and corners of diners for months now, by people who had been holding pieces of a broken thing and were trying to decide whether I was the kind of person who could be trusted to understand what it cost them to still be holding it. She slid the shoebox across the table. Inside, among the letters and clippings and the photograph, there was one more item I had not expected. A small folded piece of paper, water-stained, the ink slightly faded but legible, that Patricia Keller said her grandmother had kept separate from everything else in the box, wrapped in a piece of muslin, as if it required additional protection, even within the protection of the box itself. It was a letter, written in 1894, in the same careful hand as the entries in the diary Thorne had recovered from the Sterling house. It was from Eliza Sterling, to no one in particular, or rather to whoever found it, which is a category of addressee that I have thought about a great deal since the morning I unfolded it in that diner in Kent. It is not a long letter. I will not quote it at length, because quoting it is not the right way to receive something that was written the way it was written, with the deliberate compression of someone who knows she cannot say everything but intends to say enough. What I will say is that it accounts for what Eliza Sterling believed had happened to Sarah Miller in terms that are careful and specific and that leave no room for interpretation. It names what it names. It asks for nothing in return for the naming, because the woman who wrote it had understood something that Nathaniel Sterling and Albert Carey and William Forsythe and the 11-page file in the Oregon State Archive under the heading Abandoned Settlements, Bell County, 1894, had all in their different ways failed to understand. It understood that documents survive, that the archive is more durable than the silence imposed upon it, that the right reader, coming to the right piece of paper at the right moment, can undo, not in the courts, not in the official record, but in the only register that ultimately matters. What an institution decided, in 1894, did not warrant further inquiry. The letter ends, her name was Sarah Miller, and she was 30 years old, and she was afraid of nothing except that she might be forgotten. She was not forgotten. I stood in the clearing in Bell County, Oregon, on a cold afternoon in late October, and I read that sentence in the diner aloud to no one in particular, in the same way that I imagine Eliza Sterling, somewhere in Seattle in 1894, wrote it to no one in particular, or to everyone who would eventually come looking. The trees are still there. The names are still in the wood. Some of them are being absorbed by the bark, as trees absorb everything eventually, but slowly enough that a person standing in the right place, in the right light, can still read them. That is the thing about names carved into old-growth trees in a forest at the edge of the American frontier. The trees were already old in 1893. They will be old for a very long time to come. The silence Nathaniel Sterling built lasted 4 years. The names in the wood have lasted 130. That is not, in the end, a mystery. That is the answer. The archive does not forget. It only waits for someone to ask,